time has begun to flow again, and the fifth angel has been born.
Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvelous video. We are explorers from the farthest regions of experience. No, wait, that isn't quite right. We are kinsmen, oh blessed king of longing. Yep, that's the one. For most fans of sadomasochistic horror stories, Hellraiser is the altar they worship at, and rightfully so. The first adaptation of Clive Barker's The Hellbound Heart was exceptionally well made and terrifying to boot. But the late great Kentaro Miura took the concept of the Cenobites and spun it into such a complex web of emotions and philosophy that we might just believe in causality after all. Many believe that the Berserk manga is a love story, or a story about Guts and Griffith's rivalry, or is just a gore fest with enough character moments to keep it from getting blacklisted by publishers. Wherever your opinion might fall, the one thing the community is united upon is the fact that the God Hand is one of the most intriguing aspects of the Berserk-verse, precisely because nothing is known about them. Well, until now, because it's time we dived into this head first. So, without further ado, this is the God Hand's origins explored. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. What is the God Hand? To put it simply, the God Hand are the Cenobites with extra steps, but each step has a deep meaning behind it and is taken with great purpose. Unlike Barker's creations, who are merely reflections of humanity's depravity, the God Hand first appears during Guts' showdown with the Slug Count Apostle and the Black Swordsman arc in Part 4 of the Guardian Angels of Desire. After cornering and savagely attacking the Apostle in front of his daughter, the Count's deep desire to not die activates the Berit lying on the ground near his head and drags everyone present into a Lovecraftian interstice, where they are visited by beings he calls the Great Ones. 5 demonic entities, who are the titular guardians of desire, appear before them, and Guts immediately attacks one of them, establishing the primary conflict of his story, which consequently allows us to understand more about this group of ethereal beings. So, what is the God Hand? Well, to put it simply, they are demons to some, and angels to others. Or more like, they're demons to humans and angels to apostles. Berserk's world is one where 3-dimensional planes exist. The physical world, where we reside, the ideal world, which we haven't seen yet, and the astral world, where most of the demonic spiritual characters we see in Berserk originate from. The God Hand resides in the deepest layers of the astral world, and only presents themselves to those who have been consecrated by causality, via the medium of an object called the Berit. Think of a Berit as a key that links the astral to the physical. These keys are only sent out to people who are chosen by the concept of causality within the Berserk verse, and they can only activate it upon reaching a point of despair where they think there is truly no going back to who they were. Once they commit to giving up their humanity, these people are then asked to sacrifice the people truly dear to them. In exchange for those lives, they are granted immense power and transformed into demonic apostles. The Slug Count we spoke of earlier sacrificed his wife to gain his powers as an example, and he really loved her. Trust us, read the manga. But the God Hand are several levels above the apostles in not just rank, but also power scaling, and an ordinary Berit wouldn't quite cut it. The Crimson Berit, also known as the Egg of the King, is not something that appears to human beings as frequently as other Berits do. Being the only kind of Berit capable of creating a God Hand member, it activates once every 216 years when its owner reaches a point of despair so deep that literally nothing can keep them sane anymore. And yes, you heard that right. Despite being named the God Hand, every member of this Quinumvirate used to be human once. In the world of Berserk, history doesn't repeat itself in a circle. It's rather a spiral where similar things happen to different people across history, with changes just big enough to call their stories different. Which means that despite each member of the God Hand shown at the end of Guardian Angels of Desire Part 4 was once a human being, who effectively traded their souls for becoming powerful demonic entities akin to biblical angels. Berserk often doesn't differentiate good from evil, giving its readers a grey world veiled by the darkness of human malice, and spends much of its time exploring the consequences of the same. While on paper becoming a God Hand member sounds like an ascension, witnessing the reality of Griffith's journey to godhood makes you realize just how inhuman the idea of that kind of power truly is. And speaking of Griffith, well, let's just go ahead and meet the members of the God Hand, shall we? Slan, the first member of the God Hand to manifest during the fifth eclipse. One look at Slan should tell you what she's all about, and one line of dialogue from her should confirm your suspicions. If we're going to assume that the order in which the God Hand appeared to the Band of the Falcon during Griffith's eclipse represents their order of ascension as well, then Slan is perhaps the newest member of the group, having had her eclipse just before Griffith's. While nothing is known about her life as a human being, using the archetypes and story elements set within the world of Berserk by Kentaro Miura, we can try and piece together something of a rough image. It is known that the form of an apostle is reflective of the beast inside of them, i.e. their most depraved thoughts and feelings. That logic can also be extended to the God Hand, but on a larger scale, in our opinion, it matters where they fall in the hierarchy. And we know from Griffith's eclipse that the form a God Hand takes can be a combination of their human form and their deepest desire, melded into a being of unimaginable power. All members of the God Hand are seemingly created as a mixed representation of the four horsemen of the apocalypse and the seven deadly sins, and if that is true, then Slan is quite clearly the personification of lust in the Berserk verse. Even if we're to ignore the fact that she's the literal patron goddess of a cult of pagan worshippers whose get-togethers would be a massive hit with people like Jeffrey Epstein, her advances towards Guts in reaction to being stabbed with the Dragonslayer sword should tell you that this is one large S&M red flag you do not want to be tangled up in. There are two possible origins for Slan if we try to trace the steps that led to her ascension. Given that Slan is clearly someone who enjoys sadomasochism in all its extreme glory, we can speculate that she was either a prostitute or someone like pre-magic Farnese in her human life. Either way, she must have endured inhuman abuse in her own lifetime, likely from the man she loved, and realized that everything she had been chasing behind, a stable relationship, a respectable status in society, a fulfilling union, were all in vain. If she was a prostitute, then her internal struggle with her inherent profession and her own drive could have led to her accepting her sinful nature. If it was the Farnese situation, well, that makes it a bit easier to understand for everyone who has read the Conviction arc. But the main point is, after her ascension, Slan became a God Hand member who, besides Griffith, is the only one directly interested in Guts. During the eclipse, Slan was impressed with the swordsman's tenacity, and let's just say that made her desire him. She proved as much in Clyfarth, when she partially manifested herself through a bunch of troll intestines and practically threw herself at him. It's also possible that Slan was neither a prostitute nor a female inquisitor, but someone else entirely. But the core of her ascension doesn't change. She embraced her love for the extreme dimensions of pleasure that humans subject themselves to in her God Hand form, and that probably makes her the closest thing to the Cenobites in the entire manga. For now, she has her eye on Guts, because she wants him as her darling. But one thing is clear, if this lady asks you to accompany her to a dark alley, despite how insanely beautiful she looks, run the other way and don't stop running. Ubik. Descending from the sky of tortured souls during Griffith's eclipse, it's clear that Ubik's character design is based on Chatterer from Hellraiser, albeit Miura gave his demons flashy sunglasses and what appears to be the hint of a hood. And that might be important, because Ubik is the member of the God Hand who does most of their manipulation for them. He appears to be the standard mouthpiece of the group, often engaging would-be apostles and owners of the Crimson Bearit on a personal level, and drawing out their innermost desires with his tongue of poisoned silver. Keeping in line with our order of appearance theory, Ubik must have had his eclipse about 430 years before Griffith's, as he was the second God Hand member to appear during Griffith's eclipse. As for his human life, we think it's a safe bet to assume that Ubik used to be a preacher, a politician, or a lawyer of some kind solely because of the role he now plays as an ascended demon. In chapter 77 of the Berserk manga, Ubik convinces Griffith that whatever was happening to him and his teammates was entirely a consequence of his own will. Ubik seemingly possesses the power to give physical form to one's subconscious and speak to them while within it, as he recreated Griffith's childhood for him to show him his truth. In this glimpse of reality, Ubik took the form of an old woman, most likely the very fortune teller who gave Griffith the Crimson Bearit, and convinced him that he had always been a murderer concerned only with his own rise to the top. It is possible that Ubik influenced the fortune teller in real life as well, but most Bearits are given to their owners by unidentified persons who never actually show up in the story, except for when it focuses on the White Falcon. Ubik berates Griffith for thinking like a human when he starts showing remorse for his actions that inadvertently got tens of thousands of people killed, but the God Hand member simply tells him that that's who he has always been. Armed with this truth, Griffith takes one step closer to accepting the God Hand's offer, and so you can see how Ubik might have been someone of public importance in his past life, as he's exceptionally skilled at deception. Miura's story uses the idea that causality is the driving force in the universe and that everything is predetermined, and yet it were Ubik's words that convinced Griffith to sacrifice his comrade. Conrad's, not a fateful vision or prophecy. And also, he always has his hands clasped together in a prayer-like fashion, so assuming he's a priest of some kind, perhaps one who used his power to mislead people, makes a lot of sense to us. His eclipse might have happened because he was broken by the fact that no matter how hard he tries his hand at diplomacy, war always breaks his efforts down into tiny shards. And so, in his despair, he asked for the power to make his thoughts appear to others as the supreme truth. Much of Ubik's dialogue is treated as the truth, in fact, which makes his character even more effective as a manipulator than Shakuni from Hindu mythology, whose machinations lie at the heart of the epic Mahabharata. Within the Berserk universe, he would appear to be paralleled by the manipulative Minister Faust, who tries to use his knowledge of Griffith's retaliation on General Julius to his advantage and fails miserably. Ubik, of course, rarely fails, with the only verifiable rebuttal to his temptation coming from the Black Swordsman arc, where he failed to get the Count to sacrifice his daughter and reincarnate himself again. Ubik is the only God Hand member to not manifest in the physical world as often as his other counterparts, barring the Archangel of Demonkind, of course, whom we'll get to in a bit. Conrad. You might think that Miura was influenced by children when he designed Conrad, and you'd be right, just not entirely. Conrad's character design might look like a rip-off of Butterball, but is actually inspired by H.R. Giger's painting Landscape 18, which features the faces of multiple babies, seemingly contorted by disease and pestilence. The one face in particular that seems to have inspired Conrad's design is the face smack dab in the middle of the portrait, covered in boils and pouting as if it was spewing out the plague from its own mouth. And that would actually be an accurate description of Conrad himself, because within the Berserk verse, he seems to be the god hand of pestilence. Throw into the pot the fact that his body resembles that of a woodlouse, and our theory starts seeming more like a fact, doesn't it? Appearing third to Griffith during his eclipse, Conrad doesn't say much, but when he talks, he usually backs up Ubik's statements and reaffirms the all-pervasive nature of causality. If Conrad came before Ubik and Slan, then his eclipse took place about 650 years ago, making him one of the oldest known characters in Berserk period. And it would make sense as well, because Conrad would have emerged from a post-Geyseric world drenched in blood and plague, and the famines that arose from the destruction of Geyseric's empire. We say Conrad must be a representative of famine and pestilence because, well, he directly engineers a plague outbreak in Albion to prepare for the incarnation ceremony during the Conviction arc, manifesting amongst rats to spread disease and hasten the devolvement of all human life into debauchery as quickly as possible. Other than Slan, who is shown to have the power to influence human thought and behavior by giving them dreams, which is how she established herself as the goddess of fire that Nina's cult worshipped, Conrad is the only God Hand member whose powers directly influence the actions of humanity. As for his origins, it seems most likely to us that Conrad was a medieval doctor of some kind, whose unending quest to stymie the plague unleashed by mankind's collective evil actions eventually drove him to despair so great that he decided to become the plague himself. More disturbingly, Conrad could have been a child who received and activated a bear-it after witnessing the untold horrors that a sufferer of the plague goes through. This theory comes simply from the fact that his design is based on Giger's Landscape 18. And yes, at this point, we're going to take whatever we can get, because only Mori knows how much closure we'll get at the end of Berserk on all of the threads it has left open. It is possible that we never even get a proper origin for the three God Hand members we've discussed so far, but it's unlikely we won't get it for the next one, simply because Miura-san called him the key to understanding their goals.
Down to now, let us begin the chant of offering.
Void. Ah yes, Mr. Megamind exposed himself. When we first saw the other members of the God Hand emerge during the eclipse, it genuinely felt like something of a rehash of the first Hellraiser movie. But then entered Void, and everything changed instantly. Sure, he talks like Pinhead, but the two could not be further apart from one another in characterization. Void is the Archangel we referred to earlier in this video, and even amongst the God Hand, it appears as though his authority reigns supreme. It only takes one look at his face to truly grasp the scope of the abyss that lies behind him. Void looks like he was put through the worst torture programs mankind could have devised, and then some. And if our deductions are correct, then those scars he bears hold the key to unlocking his human identity. But first, let's address his role in the story. Void appears as a pseudo-skeletal mass of flesh and bone, who, if his Figma action figure is to be believed, has only a spine underneath his fabulous robes. Let that one sink in, eh? During Griffith's eclipse, Ubik might have been the one doing all the manipulating, but Void was the one who was filling Griffith with conviction. He was the one who acknowledged acknowledged Griffith's potential fear at beholding his destiny and told him he was chosen, but he didn't need to act upon that divine proclamation if he didn't want to. But if he still saw that castle of his dreams clear as day before his eyes, then he must seize the moment and rise up to claim it all with his strength and the strength of God alone. Thus far, Void seems to be the only person capable of performing the Invocation of Doom, which is that part of the occultation ceremony where the Bear-It holder's sacrifice of choice is adorned with the brand of sacrifice. He also has an all-encompassing view of causality, though he, like the other God Hand members, is not omniscient. Void seems to have some kind of a past with the enigmatic Skull Knight, because the latter went straight for the former after breaking into the Eclipse interstice, and this is where his origin story perhaps lies. Throughout Berserk, the shadow of a great emperor looms over Griffith's dream. 1,000 years ago, a single man called Geyserik was able to miraculously unite the entire continent of humanity under his own banner and create a golden empire. But as time passed, the once great king supposedly gave himself over to avarice and lust, and eventually his kingdom came to decry his excesses. There was a sage who loudly proclaimed Geyserik to be a sinner and was arrested by the old king for his crimes. Mosgus reveals to Farnes that this sage was reportedly tortured extensively by Geyserik in the Tower of Conviction, and that God finally listened to him when he sent 4 or 5 angels to destroy the Skull King's golden empire. In Berserk chapter 362, we see a blood memory seeped into the armor which originally belonged to the Skull Knight, and it shows us Void and another group of demonic beings staring at the helpless Skull Knight as he cradles his deceased lover in his arms. The leading theory about Void's identity is that he is the sage that Emperor Geyserik imprisoned and tortured, and that the Skull Knight is Geyserik himself. The reverse has also been suggested, and there are enough hints to make either outcomes likely. But the real reason, in our opinion, why Miura called Void the Key is not because he's the leader of the God Hand, or even that he was the last member of an old God Hand, as that infamous panel from chapter 362 shows us. It's the fact that his creation is the intersection point of 2 very interesting things. It's said that while an eclipse occurs every 216 years, an incarnation ceremony only occurs once in 1,000 years, when a God Hand member is given a corporeal body and incarnated into the physical world. Most calculations agree that Void was created either 864 or 1,080 years before Griffith, with either case being close enough to 1,000 for us to make our argument. Void's conception must have happened either before or after an incarnation ceremony, because if we take the 1,000-year metric as concrete, then the time frame for his ascendance roughly lies on either side of that mark. Now, in the blood memory Guts witnesses, the background is entirely different from Griffith's eclipse, but Guts is sure that it is an eclipse nonetheless. If that is true, then who incarnated into the world 1,000 years ago? Where? When? Why? The answers to those questions can possibly blow the whole plot line open. We think Void acts as an intersection for every major Berserk character in that all their stories will end upon being reflected in his own, and that when Void's backstory is told is when we will truly understand anything about the God Hand itself. For now, let's hope that Mori and Miura's assistants know the actual answer to that question, because otherwise we'll never learn anything about Berserk's best-kept secret. And now, it's time for the final member of the God Hand, and arguably the most despicable manga antagonist of all time. Femto. In mathematics, the term femto applies to a quadrillionth of a unit of measurement. In that field, it's used to denote the sheer smallness of the object being measured, be it size, weight, or anything else. In Berserk, it's used to signify Griffith's status as the Chosen One. Born a common man in a common city with no common belongings to speak of, Griffith dared to dream that uncommon dream of leading a nation one day and becoming a king in his own right. To that end, he assembled the Band of the Falcon and gathered up an army of loyal soldiers who revered him for his charisma and ingenious battle tactics. Using his mere mercenary outfit, Griffith was able to rise through the ranks of Midland and go from commoner to a knight commander of the Midland army, all the while thinking his comrade's will to be a part of his own. Griffith was at the height of his power and position within the world, with seemingly nothing to stop him in his past, when he lost his most important possession without even realizing it, Guts. The Black Swordsman overheard Griffith's boast of talking to a princess of his supreme conviction in his dream, and he heard him claim that a friend to him is someone who is his equal. This prompted Guts to realize he was just a valuable tool to Griffith, and he left the Band of the Falcon to find his own dream, so one day he could stand beside his friend. But Griffith took this as property rebelling against its owner, and after losing the duel that decided Guts' fate within the band, Griffith was taken over by a wave of desperation and and despair. He ended up seducing the royal princess way before he intended to, got caught, mocked the king, and was subjected to year-long torture of the extreme kind, not unlike the fate that Berserk Sage suffered at his hands. The only thing that kept him alive through multiple unimaginable forms of abuse was his dream, and the fact that Guts had taken it away from him by leaving his side. So, when the man he blamed for his current situation showed up to save him, it was more than he could take. Giving himself over to despair entirely, Griffith activated the Crimson Bearit and dragged his lifelong comrades into their worst nightmares, all so he could achieve his blood-soaked dream. After sacrificing the Band of the Falcon and accepting his inner darkness, Griffith is reborn as Femto, the final member of the God Hand and the Falcon of Darkness. As Femto, he immediately establishes his brutal reputation by attacking Casca and making Guts watch his abhorrent acts. Femto has only one goal in his mind's eye, and that is to subjugate the entire world under his feet and wings. To that end, he reincarnates into his corporeal form and takes on the role of the messianic Falcon of Light, liberating humans from the evils of the Kushan Empire whilst keeping them in the dark about being the source of all their suffering in the first place. Femto can be seen as an amalgamation of the Horseman of War and Conquest, because those two things are the foundation of his dream. He is as cruel and evil as beautiful as he looks, and with Griffith having kidnapped Casca from Elfhelm and bringing her back to Falconia in Chapter 371, it looks like Kujimori and Kentaro Miura's assistants are putting the chess pieces into place for the endgame of Berserk. The climactic arc of this masterpiece of manga will see Guts contend with the man for whose sake he once wielded his own sword, and how the spiral of time unmasks the men who came before them and were destined to do the same thing as them. Despite being the newest member of the God Hand, Femto is its most important addition, the only one out of them to be able to exist in the physical world at all, and is the catalyst for Guts' bloody path of vengeance. Femto is quite literally the reason why the series is titled Berserk, and if that doesn't give you all the information you need about his origins, then we highly recommend you go read the manga, because nothing we've said here can do justice to Miura's work. Marvelous verdict. The number of times the God Hand has appeared in a given volume of Berserk can be counted on one hand, and it still won't reach the tip of your little finger. Yet the malevolent aura they exude and the perfect pacing that Miura employed with their introduction makes them the most important aspect of a series that is mainly known for its gore and violence. Sure, Berserk is bloodier than most seinen manga, and it can feel gratuitous at times, but that's just it. It really isn't. In a world where the spawns of trolls literally xenomorph burst through their mothers, and apostles are the names of demonic entities who follow a corrupted god, how can you expect anyone to not fight for their lives like a berserker of old? And ask yourselves, if the God Hand came knocking on your door with promises of eternal power and life in exchange for a sacrifice, how many of you could truly resist it? That is where Berserk's violence becomes less self-serving and more a commentary on our society, and that distinction is driven home by the God Hand. They represent both the zenith and the lowest moralistic point of existence at the same time, which is why whenever they show up in a chapter, you know something bad is about to go down, and things only get worse from there. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.